when you open the door for somebody else.
Welcome back to the Vaccine Conversation with Melissa and Dr. Bob. Good to be back, everybody. How's it going, Melissa? You're laughing at me already, huh?
Oh, these intros are so funny. It's so funny to have to do an intro because we really are just like having a conversation about this stuff.
Yeah,
so it's
yeah.
really funny to do these intros.
Right.
So, hi, I'm doing fine, Dr. Bob. Thank you for asking. How are you?
Well, it's funny because, I mean, we'll be sitting here talking for like 5 minutes before we even get started. So it's kind of strange to like have to stop talking for, for a few seconds and then start talking. But I just want to say it's the new Dr. Bob. It's the closer.
Please tell us more.
It's the closer to the microphone, Dr. Bob. Can you tell the difference, audience?
I think they can.
Yes, yeah, because let's compare because like we realized during all the other podcasts I was kind of sitting back in my chair, casually kind of talking back from here.
But see, I think this comes from the fact that you're used to talking on stages or a lot of conventions and things that you do where you do speaking events. And by nature, you kind of are going to be louder and you're talking to a bigger group of people. And then, of course, my personal experience comes from recording because I'm a singer, if many people didn't know. And so I'm used to being close to the mic and not really talking that much because I don't want to lose my voice or use too much of my voice. So I try to conserve it as much as possible and use the microphone for that reason. So I've been much closer to the mic this whole time. And apparently...
And I've been back here talking,
and then we had a review that talked about how I seem to be louder and more dominant. This theme keeps coming up. But I'm actually quieter, just closer to the mic. So now Dr. Bob's going to be closer to the mic and then a little quieter. Too.
So I don't, blow Melissa away from across the table. But so like here's the old me, and now here is the new Dr. Bob.
Uh-oh.
And I didn't realize the difference so much until I put the headphones on and Matt played the recording back, and I was like, whoa, I actually kind of have a radio voice, maybe.
It's so funny though, and I think I said this to you before. I feel like if you were the one that was louder or quote unquote more dominant or interrupting,
it would be okay.
It would be totally acceptable.
Right.
And acceptable on two reasons. One, because you're a male. And two, because you have a title. And a title that warrants validity to your opinion and everything that you might say. And I find that really funny because I feel like people have these subconscious biases towards people. And God forbid a woman makes her opinion known. And God forbid she makes her opinion known sometimes over a man's opinion. And God forbid that man happens to be a doctor. Like, it's pretty funny how subliminal I think some of that is. And I think it kind of echoes the relationship that we see in a doctor's office and that parents have with their doctors as they feel that same it's an invisible hierarchy that exists. And while a specialist like yourself has the experience to warrant a title, that doesn't necessarily negate the value or the validity or the weight of a parent's opinion. Because like you've mentioned before, many parents that you come across are extremely educated and have not just done their research on vaccines, but are smart individuals. They excel in whatever their particular field is. And women too. Oh my God, that actually they read and they are educated and intelligent. And there are oftentimes I feel as women that your doctor, you feel already like your doctor doesn't think your opinion means anything. And so I just find it really funny that in even reviews of this particular topic, you see some of that same stuff come up. And I have to wonder how much of that, becomes our cultural norms and our, the subliminal thing that we've kind of grown up with, that unconscious that we don't really realize. But
I think the reviewers that discuss this issue, I know for sure, and we've heard back from one of them, since we actually talked about this before, and they definitely weren't trying to be negative. They love the podcast, they think it's great, and I think it was just kind of their observations. I guess, for the two or three of you that have commented on this, we understand where you're coming from, and that you're not you're not trying to be mean. No, they're not trying to be mean. I think they're just talking. But I want to say, I want to reach back here to my pile of science. There actually is some science, some research articles on this that we found that I thought was sorry, I'm shuffling through. Can you hear the shuffling through?
But
my
that's I like
papers?
that. It makes you sound smarter
I know,
because you've
I
got
know.
papers happen. It's not just your opinion.
Right. So it was an article about interrupters and that linguists say it's the Jewish way, or it's also the Italian way, as you said. It's a way of a variety of cultures, and I love how they talk about it. They don't, instead of calling it interrupting, they call it high involvement cooperative overlapping. Right, which is
and they go on to describe that,
right,
what
right,
that means.
Right, but what it is, it's a way of showing interest and appreciation in what the other person's saying. So in reality, it's kind of a compliment, when I'm saying something so fascinating and brilliant.
That's usually not what I interrupt. No, but it's finishing the sentence of someone and agreeing with them is showing that level of, I get what you're saying and I'm with you and I support what you just said.
Right.
Instead of it being rude and thinking, what I'm about to say is more important than what you said. It's not that. People think it's that.
Right.
But in reality, it's a way to lift you back up and be like, yes, you're right. You're validated in what you say because I feel the same way on that too. And we're on the same page.
Yes. And in case people are thinking, gosh, is Dr. Bob annoyed by this interrupting, or does he sit there and is he grumpy about it? No. I mean, I've spent the last 3.5 years talking to Melissa, and I know I've honestly learned every time she interrupts me, it's because she has probably a much more intelligent and articulate way to explain what I'm trying to explain. Like I can't always put it in the right words. And then she's like, "Here, Dr. Bob, here's kind of what I'm thinking about it." And then what she kind of says really resonates. And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, that's what I was trying to say. Just my brain couldn't put it together in real plain English."
Can I see this study? I want to tell people the name of this study.
Oh, it's on the front page there. Yeah.
Okay, so in case you're looking this up, because this was an actual study.
Right, and it's from someone from Georgetown University, where I went to medical school. So yay, Georgetown.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
No wonder it resonated with you so well. So this is called Interrupters. Linguist says it's the Jewish way, and the intro line says, the next time someone accuses you of interrupting, you might want to explain that you're not being rude, and that's true. Is this cooperative overlapping? You're talking as another person continues to speak. It says it's a traditional style that actually shows interest and appreciation.
Right.
And this is a professor of linguistics.
Yeah, and in some of the later, I sort of underline some of the later parts. They say people interpret silences, and people who interrupt a lot, people who kind of like to talk over others or just interrupt, and they interpret silences and pauses in the conversation as evidence of lack of rapport or interest. Meaning, if two people who commonly interrupt all the time, if someone's talking and the other person is not interrupting or is kind of being quiet, the talker almost feels like they don't support them or they're not interested. But it's funny, if you have two different people, say a quiet person and someone who likes to talk a lot and interrupt a lot, if they're both talking, the person who's really quiet or people who are not accustomed to this style of conversation, they'll see interrupting as rudeness, verbal hogging, and lack of interest in the quieter person who's speaking. But the reality is, I mean, Melissa and I are two different people. They talk like I'm quieter. I'm definitely quieter, just in general. And you like to talk a lot of the time, but as you said before, you also like to not talk at home.
Well, yeah, what
just to rest. And
it's called an introverted extrovert. Like it's an actual thing. Like where you might feel like you are the outgoing, talkative person, and people assume that's how you are all the time. But a lot of times for these kind of people, like myself, you actually need days of silence to recover from moments that you have this type of interaction with a lot of people or environments where a lot of people are focusing their attention on you. That takes so much out of you that you end up needing a lot of quiet time just to kind of find that balance. There are those that are pretty much talkative all the time. I'm not one of those. And as I've gotten older, it's gotten more apparent to me that I am not that way. I really do value my silence, which is probably why having children has been so hard for me because you get no silence.
Because your older child just likes to talk. And
even my younger one, I have both of my kids are very talkative, and I'm sure they get that from me, which is it's good. It's a good sign of development for them and all that. But not having silence makes it really hard when you're needing to multitask on things. It also makes it hard when you're digesting difficult material. So something like this topic, when you talk about vaccines and you're looking at research studies and medical terminology, and you're going deep into researching, it requires so much concentration that additional noise becomes really difficult. And that's why sometimes being able to do this research becomes really difficult. And you can only do it when the kids are asleep,
right,
so that you can actually focus on this. But I thought that study was just really funny because it just goes to show you how differently people communicate and how we think differently about what the same thing that happens. We view it as something positive or something negative. Right. And I agree with exactly what you said about the silences. And I've had this conversation with friends before. Sometimes when you hear silences, you feel like, I need to solve this. This silence is uncomfortable. This is awkward. And this makes me feel uncomfortable. And I think others are uncomfortable too. And I just want to make everybody feel comfortable. So then you fill the silences because you're trying to facilitate conversation. You're not trying to dominate the conversation. Right. You're trying to facilitate it. And then other people see it as the opposite. They're thinking, why are you always jumping in on silences?
Yeah, so I'm officially saying, Melissa, don't change. We like you the way you are. I like you the way you are. I would rather have interrupting Melissa than less Melissa.
I'm going to be conscious of it because I do understand that the audio experience is very different than being in person. And sometimes being able to see body language, you can anticipate someone is going to interject. And so it doesn't feel as stark maybe. Right. And then here in this situation, you're not seeing me getting ready to interrupt. So it feels very out of the blue. And so I will be conscious of it because, of course, I want to be a good co-host and I want to be I want to make our podcast, easy to listen to and something that's comfortable for all. But having said all of that, I can only do so much. Outside of it, it's genetic.
And it's funny. I feel like we sometimes edit out like a minute or two of a podcast here and there. I almost feel like some of the last couple of podcasts, you've asked me to edit out a few circumstances where you've interrupted or
not
something.
Not interrupt.
And
not
I don't know if that
so
was on purpose, if you're consciously doing that, or if it was just the content that.
Not so much interrupting, but just sometimes ranting. Sometimes, I'm still
anyway,
going.
we should get on with today's topic, I suppose, because today's topic is not about interrupting,
but
or what they call it. I even forget what they call it.
Cooperative.
High involvement, cooperative overlapping.
But of course, this is a journey, right? It's not a destination, and so people are getting to know us.
Yeah, they are getting right,
and they're. This is all in a grander context of the way we communicate, the topics we cover, and this thing.
Yeah,
so yes, we will get into it, but this is never lost time. Don't worry.
Okay, correct. I mean, people, if you hit like the fast forward 15 seconds, go back. This was really fascinating because anyways, it's a lot of fun. So today we're going to talk about why mandatory vaccination laws are unnecessary, and in fact they won't even work. And this kind of comes on the heels of a vaccination law that was passed in California. 3 years ago now, almost 4 years ago now, that made vaccines mandatory to attend any school and childcare.
We should clarify, they've always been mandatory since the 90s.
Right, but people have been allowed to opt out. Right?
Yeah, this is why a lot of times when people clarified, 277 as a law of mandatory vaccines, it wasn't completely true because we've had mandatory vaccines as far as school entry, but it was a handful of them, and there were the options to opt out with either personal belief exemptions or religious exemptions depending on your state. So in our state, California, what 277 did was it removed that. It removed the right to opt out. And so instead of just having a list of mandatory vaccines, that list got longer, and then you were not able to exercise a choice to opt out of a few or.
Right, and these laws have been in Mississippi and West Virginia for a very long time.
The stricter version of these laws. Right,
stricter version of this law. And in fact, Mississippi and West Virginia are at almost the very bottom of child health, of how healthy their children are, in the state rankings, which is completely unrelated and ironic.
It's a coincidence.
Yeah, it's a coincidence. So California joined those two states, and this year, right now, they're trying to pass a similar law in Maine, and they're also looking, I believe, at trying to pass a similar law in Connecticut.
Well, and we've seen in Connecticut and New York trying to pass
and New
flu
York
vaccine.
But New York is actually looking at passing the same California version of the law this year as well. In fact. This is just what we're seeing visibly,
right.
but in the background, almost every state has been trying to get this sort of bill introduced every single year for the last few years.
Or
almost every state.
More correctly, almost every lobbyist has found a representative in almost every state to push this, because really this is not the individual states saying, oh my God, we had a crazy outbreak this last year and we need to do something about it. This is a national agenda that comes from pharmaceutical lobbyists that are behind the scenes. They find people in the legislation who in the legislature that can be on board and be the one who's putting this forward.
Right.
Because this is not individually, this many states really agree it needs to be this strict. Because that's a different thing, don't you think?
No, you're totally right. Yeah. It's not like all the legislators in all the states are sitting around saying, oh my gosh, yeah, we have to pass mandatory vaccination laws.
Like because of a reason, because of a public health crisis.
It is driven by lobbyists, paid for by the medical organizations and the pharmaceutical organizations in a state, that they try to create an agenda in the legislature every year. Most legislators are not even thinking about this.
Right.
And then it takes an outbreak to be kind of the what's it called? The driving force behind that gets all the legislators to think about it. Right. And that's kind of what happened in California, the Disneyland outbreak.
And that's what's happening in New
York.
York.
Brought it to the forefront. Yeah. So there's an outbreak of measles in New York. And but there's two factors. Number one, it's always there from lobbyists and one or two legislators. The other driving force is an outbreak. The third factor is a shift in the liberal conservative balance in a legislature. In California, this was very much a Democratic Party bill that was presented. Virtually all the Democrats voted for it. Virtually all the Republicans voted against it. And but because we have a Democratic majority, it was passed.
And the Republicans vote against it because of parental rights and government overreach.
Right.
A lot from the beginning, they automatically feel like medical interventions should be something that a parent has a right over their child, and the state should not be involved in making those kinds of decisions. Right from the beginning.
Right.
Before even looking at the data. But then when we put the data forth, many Democrats actually started second guessing their original votes.
Right, exactly. And in California, what was interesting, almost all Republicans voted against it. 2 Republicans voted for it. When you look at the Democrats, a very significant number of Democrats voted against the bill. One of the Democrats, called it a draconian measure, a huge, overreach of government police powers. And so, a number of Democratic representatives did not see, that the bill was needed, but there was enough of a majority to get the bill passed. And that's actually, unfortunately, what's just happened in New York State. New York State has had a Republican majority in their legislature, or at least it was equal as balanced. But the Democratic Party just got like a very significant higher level of a majority, and so I think they might actually try to make this happen this year on the heels of the measles outbreak.
And what's the deal with the measles outbreak there?
Well, it's been very well contained and very small. There was basically an outbreak a couple months ago that I think they had over 100 cases. It was pretty much contained, but then there's a break in about, I think, 5 or 6 weeks or something. I don't know all the exact details, but then they just had 2 new cases in New York. And are
these in religious group communities?
Yes. So yes, it's in the Jewish communities out there. Because of, I guess, a number of the Jewish community members
are they Orthodox?
Orthodox don't vaccinate. But I don't think there's any higher level of people in the Jewish community that don't vaccinate compared to the general community at large. It's just, I think the Jewish community, they tend to call it, they're all kind of living in some of the same communities. They all attend the same schools. And so anyway, I mean, I'm not sure that even matter so much one way or the other. But yeah, there's an outbreak, and so they're looking at this out there.
Well, I remember
to push
what was it
forward.
in 2014 when they had the large outbreak that was also in a community of the 600
Yes,
some cases.
an Amish community in Ohio.
So that's the
had a
reason
very
I bring
large
that up
outbreak.
is because sometimes when you hear these outbreaks, we're not talking about just randomly split up. We're talking about in a specific group of people who are choosing not to vaccinate. So it
Correct.
spreads, but again, it's contained and it spreads within that particular community. Usually we hear no complications and no.
No one has been harmed.
deaths.
No one has died, fortunately. So I feel like
But didn't I predict this? I told you actually a couple months ago. I'm like, I bet there's going to be an outbreak, quote unquote outbreak this year that's going to fuel
Right.
legislation in February.
Yeah.
Do you remember when I said that?
Yeah.
I said that because in Europe they're having
Right.
some large number of cases of measles, and I was saying to myself, this is going to show up in our country. As it relates
Yeah.
to new bills that are being put
Yeah.
forth as, again, a catalyst. Is that the word you were looking
catalyst.
for?
Thank you.
As a catalyst for putting this
You
legislation.
should have interrupted
forward.
me and said, "Catalyst, Dr. Bob."
I had to
Catalyst.
wait.
is
I
what
had to
you're
wait
trying
till a silent time when it was awkward.
That's so funny. So I feel like basically there's three main reasons why we believe mandatory vaccine laws are unnecessary and why they won't work. And the three reasons are basically there is no infectious disease crisis that warrants that our government exercise police powers and make vaccines mandatory. That's number one. Any infectious disease outbreak that we do have is always very small and very well contained. So there's no crisis. And if the government is going to exercise police powers, there has to be a crisis. Number two, the number two reason, which I think is maybe even a more important reason, is most vaccines don't even prevent the spread of its disease. So even if you do vaccinate everybody or everyone who's going to school is vaccinated, it's not. A lot of these vaccines don't prevent the spread, so there's a lot of vaccines that are being mandated unnecessarily because it doesn't matter if you're vaccinated or not in certain respects. So we'll talk about that. And then the third reason in my mind is the uncertain safety profile of the Centers for Disease Control vaccine schedule makes mandating it ethically problematic, in our opinion. It's really hard to justify mandating medicine that we know is going to harm some people. And so those, I think, are three.
And yet they did it anyway.
Yes, they did it anyway. Right.
I mean, because that would be the that relates to the ethical conversation that we had the other day. How can you ethically mandate something that you know you're going to have a certain percentage of victims, so to speak? How is that even possible that you can move forward on that? But like you're saying too, what we know about diseases, what we know about the spread of diseases, what we know about waning immunity, there's a lot that factors into whether or not this even logically makes sense as far as achieving the outcome that they're looking for. Not to mention that we know that vaccine rates are so high already. They're already at 95.1% according to the state, right? Going any higher than that, you wonder, what's the purpose? What's the force when you've got things, when things are so high? And JB was talking about in his book, JB Hanley was talking about how in the mid 80s, the vaccine rates were at about 50 to 60% for all of these diseases we so fear, like whooping cough and measles and mumps. 50 to 60% with no major outbreaks.
Right.
So you're thinking when you're at 95%, why would you need to pass a law that takes away the right for 1 or 2% of your state to opt out when you're way higher, considerably higher, 30% higher than what we've been with no outbreaks in the past? Just people weren't aware. They didn't know what the numbers were before. Now that people know, now everybody's fixated on particular numbers. Oh, we've got to achieve this herd immunity. We have to achieve it. And so as if that, again, becomes the catalyst. These numbers, this is what we need, legislators. So please sign this bill to pass this so that we can stay disease-free. Nobody's taking the time to question and go, well, wait, what were we 10 years ago? What about 20 years ago? We weren't having any outbreaks. What were the numbers then? Because if they're just getting to 95 now, how come we didn't have all huge outbreaks and epidemics before?
Right, but who is very vocal about questioning this and asking, why are we doing this is Bobby Kennedy, RFK Jr. I'm friends with Bobby Kennedy. I've met him on a number of occasions and worked with him, and he does great work. And he actually just yesterday, his group put out an article called "Vaccine Mandates Don't Safeguard Children's Rights or Health." And he kind of goes through some of the legislative and legal history of these laws and how they came about. And I just like to read a few quotes from his piece, because I think they're very compelling. And a lot of what he's saying also comes from Mary Holland, who is a legal scholar at New York University. And she wrote a paper about this in 2010. Regarding the old Supreme Court decision. So basically, he says, for decades, the U.S. government has made compulsory childhood vaccination one of the cornerstones of its public health policy. Outside the U.S., countries' vaccination policies range from completely voluntary to aggressive. Some nations are promoting vaccinations but leaving the decision up to the parents, and others are pushing a little harder by financially incentivizing vaccination. Some of the countries with mandatory vaccination have modest policies that focus on a single vaccine like polio, and some have, they're broader. But a lot of countries choose not to enforce or strictly enforce their mandates. So in the U.S., the legal edifice shoring up the compulsory childhood vaccination program is surprisingly flimsy, meaning there's very little legal basis for doing this historically. And the legal basis for this really relies primarily on 2 century-old Supreme Court decisions, a decision from 1905 and a decision from 1922. And Mary Holland talks about in her paper, current childhood mandates are not only radically different from what the earlier courts and the legislators envisioned a century ago when they made these statements, but these mandates are unreasonable and oppressive, and have led to perverse results that do not safeguard children's rights and health. Sorry, it's a lot of information. But so this isn't just Melissa and I talking. This is a scholar, a legal scholar from New York University. This is Bobby Kennedy, who's done a lot of work. Incredibly brilliant man, and is doing a lot of work to try to safeguard children's health in our country. So yeah, I appreciate Bobby's work and what he's doing, and
he's a super smart,
yeah,
very intelligent. If
smart.
you've seen him speak, he is just so captivating because his knowledge base is so wide, and all of his experience as an attorney in environmental issues, and his ability to read science, and his ability to ask the tough questions has been so inspiring. When you see him, he has a lot of passion for this issue, and this issue has now turned into mercury in vaccines.
Yeah, and his group is Children's Health Defense. You can find them online, and it's a nonprofit. You can donate and help support. I basically the basic premise of the rest of his article is basically the Supreme Court decisions that everybody now is basing these vaccine mandates on have been completely misinterpreted. Basically, these original Supreme Court decisions a century ago were based on emergencies and health crises that posed an imminent danger. People were in serious danger from diseases, and these original, I thought this was really interesting. The original Supreme Court decisions had robust cautionary language, warning people about the potential for arbitrary and oppressive abuse of police power, and warning people in the future not to abuse the police power. And the original Jacobson court documents that the Supreme Court judge, urged courts to be vigilant, to examine and thwart unreasonable assertions of state power regarding this issue. And that's exactly what's happening today. People are using kind of the general idea of the original Supreme Court cases and without, understanding the complete picture that the original judges tried to warn about. Yeah, maybe we'll mandate this because of extreme emergency. And even though they mandated, the person they were mandating the vaccines for could still pay a fine, could pay money to still get out of the vaccine. They said, we do not want this to go further. We don't want the states to become oppressive over
and
this.
they used measles, in Disneyland. They definitely used that as like a state of emergency, almost like a state of emergency. They use that as a public health crisis.
Yes.
And that crisis was absolutely what pushed the tighter restraint. And that's where most people say you need to be careful. It's a slippery slope, right? As soon as you allow a little more, then all of a sudden the state now has all of the complete rights as it comes to what you do with your child. And that also leads over into medical treatment for your child. Like if your child has cancer and doing chemotherapy and those kind of treatments, that's an issue that's out there right now too, as far as what the state can make you do. But I was looking up the measles outbreak, and I know we're going to talk about measles later, but I looked up the outbreak that we had in Disneyland. And one of the things that's funny on the California Department of Public Health, one of the things that they say is this outbreak captured the attention of the public. It started at Disneyland, quote, the happiest place on earth. And this is exactly what they write, and had all the elements of a good news story. I mean, like the California Department of Public Health is in their review, this is the immunization branch, in their review of the measles outbreak, they're actually acknowledging that this was a good news story. And I mean, I find that, and this was a bullet point in their PowerPoint presentation that they had at their meeting or whatever that they documented this from. And it said this outbreak advanced the national conversation about immunization and led to state initiatives to limit or eliminate the personal belief exemptions to school immunization requirements. And it says, interestingly enough, as we know, out of the cases with verified immunization status and the cases that had self-reporting immunization status, it was actually 45% that were vaccinated.
Wow.
Higher than I originally thought. Because look at what they say. They say 49 people did not have their records, 48 were adults, and 20 of whom self-reported being vaccinated. They don't include those people. Even though they said, yes, I was vaccinated as a child, like they don't count that. So they assume that the number of unvaccinated is so much higher. This is a way that they distort some of the data to make it look like these types of laws are necessary. But if you have a public health crisis like measles is spreading around Disneyland, people are genuinely concerned. Oh my God, my infant is 1, they haven't had their vaccine yet, or my infant is younger than 1, or I have an elderly parent, or I'm worried about this, and this. You would assume that kind of level of crisis would be the vaccine is going to prevent that from happening. And yet you're looking at data that shows not only did we have a huge percentage that were adults, but on top of that, you have almost half of them from ones that they knew their status were vaccinated. And you say, so really this law that they're trying to pass in Maine, or these laws are trying to get stricter, are not going to achieve the thing that they're trying to achieve, which is to keep people completely disease-free. And the reason they can't achieve that is because that's not how these diseases work. That's not how vaccines work. And so the reality comes down to, it doesn't matter how tight your laws are going to get. And we've discussed, there are, and we'll probably, I guess, do a separate episode on this, but there have been 17 documented cases, probably more than that I saw with studies that talked about fully vaccinated or almost fully vaccinated communities having disease outbreak. 17 different cases of communities that were fully vaccinated and still had an outbreak, which means it doesn't matter if you get to 96%. It doesn't matter if you get to 97%. It doesn't matter if you strip away everyone's human rights to get to this certain number. The diseases are still going to spread. We know that is absolutely true for pertussis, and we know it's true for measles.
Right, because in some people, not, in a few percentage of people for measles vaccine, the vaccine doesn't work, but also the vaccine wears off after 10 or 15 years. So we have this huge, effectively unvaccinated adult population. And again, in the Disneyland outbreak, over half the cases were in adults. And what really bugs me is during the Disneyland outbreak, there was not a single case of measles passed in any schools or daycares, not even one. But that's the only place they decided to mandate vaccines. Measles was passed in doctor's offices, emergency rooms, restaurants, grocery stores,
churches,
Disneyland, churches. That's where measles was passed. Not a single case in schools. So I know, I'm a legislator. Let's pass a law that mandates measles vaccine in the only place that no one caught measles during the outbreak. And it's kind of funny, but the reason they did choose to pass this vaccination mandate for schools only and daycares is that's the only place they have control over. That's the only kind of entity that the legislators can control and make laws for. I mean, you're not going to be able to pass a law that mandates measles vaccine to enter a restaurant or go to Disneyland. But so then, why, ethically is it okay to pass a law to mandate them?
Well, and what was
for
that?
School?
What was that sister law that they had that was for parent volunteers or
where they
employees?
mandated flu vaccine and Tdap vaccine for whooping cough for all volunteers in schools.
And this was
parent
passed the
volunteers in
same year as
schools.
277.
I forget. Yeah, you're right. It was. Yeah.
It didn't get as much attention because honestly, so much of us were focused on 277 that all of a sudden this other one passes and it is a barrier from adults being able to either work in a school environment or come visit and work as a volunteer in their child's school environment without having these particular immunizations too.
And ironically, both the flu vaccine and the Tdap vaccine doesn't prevent a parent from catching those infections and bringing them to school. They'll just be less sick. Have the symptoms will be less severe, but they'll still bring those diseases to school. And one kind of beef I have with these laws is kind of like the number two topic for why these laws should not be necessary and won't work is how can you pass a law that mandates a flu vaccine and a whooping cough vaccine for all daycare and school volunteers when that's not even going to work? How can you even think about passing that law? And it's because there are lobbyists with an agenda and they find a legislator who agrees with them.
And often it's one thing at a time. They do a little bit here, a little bit, and they work themselves to that point because they know it's going to be too much at first if somebody says, we're going to take away all your rights for this. So they do little bits at a time. I mean, you heard with Connecticut just over winter break how they made it mandatory to have a flu shot between the ages of 2 and 4 years old to return to daycare by January 1st. So if your child was returned, so they actually passed it. You cannot go back to school if your child or in a daycare or early school setting for 2 to 4 years old if you do not have a flu shot.
Yeah, just like New York. Yeah,
like New York.
Yeah.
And I think to myself, that is the one vaccine that is the most risky and the least effective.
Right. And we know doesn't prevent the spread.
And doesn't prevent the spread. And how in the world could they convince people? I mean, even adults don't believe that the flu vaccine works that well. I'm sure some of these legislators absolutely don't get vaccinated.
Well, no, you're probably right. We know, flu vaccine uptake is probably about 50% in general.
Yeah, even
nationwide.
A little less than that.
Right. So we know, half those legislators sitting on these councils aren't getting the flu vaccine.
But for
likely.
a child too, like why would you risk? I mean, a child is going to be more at risk of some type of reaction, knowing how these reactions are strong in adults. A 2 to 4 year old, that just seems like the last place I would be forcing it. In fact, we've always said that the flu vaccine and the HPV vaccine tend to be the ones that have caused so much controversy because of their injuries that most people are not on board with mandating them. And yet when I saw this happen over winter break, I'm thinking, how could this happen? How can I saw mothers talking about, I have nowhere to take my child, but there's no way I'm going to give them the flu vaccine. And at that point, it's January. Like this flu season has already happened, even though they say the peak is oftentimes February, from what I saw on data. I find it really interesting that they're still going to take away your right to go to school halfway through the season for something that, again, we know it's not effective and we know it causes injuries. The number one reported 60% of all of the VAERS reports.
Yeah, what scares me is we know kids who are allergic to eggs can have a serious allergic reaction to the flu vaccine. They can even die from anaphylactic shock if you're allergic to eggs because they make flu vaccine in eggs. And they make an egg-free version for adults, but they don't make an egg-free version for children. But what really bugs me is the manufacturers, and I appreciate them for this, the manufacturers who make the flu vaccine, they warn in black and white, if you are allergic to eggs, do not get this vaccine. it's in really,
And when your
obvious
child's two,
writing.
you might not really know that yet.
Yeah, or even 1 or even 6 months. If you have a 6-month-old, the flu vaccine is recommended for as young as 6 months. Most of those kids haven't had eggs yet, so you don't even know. But what bugs me is the Centers for Disease Control says, yes, egg allergic patients should get the flu vaccine. You just need to make sure you get the flu vaccine, even if you know you're allergic to eggs. The flu vaccine is so important, you should get it anyway. Make sure you get it in a doctor's office
Just in case.
where there's emergency life-saving equipment so the doctor can, resuscitate you and, put the paddles on you and yell clear and shock you back to life if you are allergic to eggs and you go into anaphylactic shock and they give you epinephrine. And I mean, to me, that just boggles my mind. And families in Connecticut and New York, if the CDC says the medical, the standard of care and our recommendation is get the flu shot anyway, then egg allergic families can't opt out of the flu shot if they want to put their kids in daycare. It boggles my mind that they would force this on people.
I mean,
I
this
just
is
can't
the
believe
worst
it.
vaccine you could probably get. Like, as far as if you had to mandate one of them, this is the worst because highest number of injuries, least amount of efficacy. This is the one you could say no. And most adults, look, like you're saying, more than half of adults are opting out. Only 32% of adults between 18 and 50 are, opt into the flu shot. 32%. That means 68% are saying, no, I don't think this is a good idea.
Yeah.
But they're making it so that, that you cannot opt out for your children that have to be somewhere if you are working full time, which a lot of families are.
Yeah, and I pulled out Bobby Kennedy's article again. I didn't say this before, but it's very, very poignant. There's a judge in North Dakota in 1919 that actually he calls it prescient or whatever. He was basically predicting the future. This North Dakota judge he pronounced the forced vaccination for smallpox was an act of barbarism. But he also wrote about the self-interest of the medical profession and vaccine manufacturers, the class that reap a golden harvest from vaccination and the diseases caused by it. And the judge stated, every person of common sense, he's talking about you and me, and observation must know that it is not the welfare of the children that causes the vaccinators to preach their doctrines and to incur the expense of lobbying for vaccination statutes. And if anyone says to the contrary, he either does not know the facts or he has no regard for the truth. And again, the reality is, what I was just begging to happen during the legislative hearings in California, and I don't know why this didn't happen in Connecticut and New York. All I wanted was for one of the legislators sitting on those councils that passed the law, maybe a legislator who was against this law, who was opposed to mandatory vaccinations. I wanted one of them to look the legislator who wrote the laws and trying to pass the laws, look them in the eye during the hearings and say, can you tell me, knowing for a fact that we know this flu vaccine doesn't prevent the spread, and we know this whooping cough vaccine doesn't prevent the spread, and then in the case of California, we know the polio vaccine doesn't prevent the spread. Knowing those facts, and knowing the fact that hepatitis B vaccine is not transmitted in school, how can you justify passing this law? You just answer me that one simple little question. The legislator wouldn't have any medical answer other than vaccines are so important. Vaccines in general save lives. We as a legislative body should simply mandate all of them.
And just support them.
Right. And
Support
no
the
one
program.
asks. No one asks the most simplest of questions.
Well, it's, I've been reading some of...
Am I talking quiet enough? I feel like I'm in the mic.
I don't know.
How am I
might need to go a
sounding
little
on it?
quieter.
Should I tone it down a little bit? Okay. I feel
more
like,
DJ Bob.
well, that was a rant. Okay, I should. Okay, rants are allowed. Rants are allowed to be loud. Okay, going back to normal volume.
I've been reading Dr. Robert Mendelsohn, a couple of his books actually, and I just started his Confessions of a Modern Heretic. And he has this quote in here, which I found so interesting. He uses the analogy that modern medicine, which could really be substituted with the vaccine program, is like a church. It's like a religion. And that some of the ways in which they convince people to get on board with medical interventions is a type of essentially like a brainwashing. He doesn't say that exact word, but he has this quote I thought was interesting. He says, "So heavily does the church of modern medicine rely on faith that if everyone somehow simply forgot to believe in it for just one day, the whole system would collapse." And it reminds me of these legislators, they, like you're saying, they couldn't answer that one question because they just believe in the program. We must support vaccines. If we don't support vaccines, the entire program will crumble. If it crumbles, we are all going to, die of diseases. There's this need for people to keep the vaccine program to maintain its right now it seems pristine, to maintain its condition, because God forbid a crack starts to happen and it starts to fall, it will tumble. It's not one of those things that will just drop down a few notches and then people will build it back up. It's one of these things with the amount of information that we know and the things that have been kept from people. There is that fear of it crumbling. And he says, for how else could any institution get people to do things that modern medicine gets people to do without inducing a profound suspension of doubt? How else are these legislators able to pass mandatory laws without somebody asking the question you're talking about?
Yes.
People are not willing to ask the question because they just are going along with the program. And the program is the status quo. Do not upset the status quo. This is the status quo. The vaccine program is fine. Vaccines save lives. And I just started a new book last night because I'm like half reading like 6 books. But I started a new one about the PR industry, and it is really interesting.
It looked like a comic book or something.
Yeah.
I saw the picture on Facebook.
Because it's kind of based on publicity that really started in the 50s.
Okay.
And how these ad agencies, these PR agencies, were used not just to help you advertise your product, but how to psychologically manipulate your customer base and how to do damage control if somebody else was coming for you. So they were talking about a guy writing a book on the chemicals that were in the water and affecting the chemical levels in foods, and one of the foods were raisins. And so at this point, the California Raisin Board found out about it. The PR agency that works for them found out about this book that this guy was just trying to expose chemical-free fruits and vegetables and foods for people. He thought people had a right to know that there were 100 different chemicals inside these raisins. This was back in 1985.
Okay.
I think, somewhere around the early 80s. And so the PR agency went into full attack mode, and they basically went on every talk show that he was on, and they would counter it. They used all of their contacts to make sure that his spots never aired. Like he was supposed to air on the Today Show, never happened. All of the things that sound so much like what we're dealing with in this vaccine conversation, that you basically have a PR company working for the vaccine manufacturers to create their own viral messaging about diseases are so scary. Look at this baby that just died. Everybody go get your vaccine. And also anti-attack, these attack campaigns that are going against anybody who raises questions. And they automatically vilify the person. They discredit them. They keep them from being aired on TV and having the audience to give information to so people can make their own, questions. They can have their own critical thinking. And as I'm reading, I'm thinking, this is crazy. You could literally substitute what this particular case is in with what we're talking about in vaccines. And you realize this machine that is at work is not just at work for vaccines, obviously. It's at work for all sorts of other things. It was at work for the tobacco industry, for genetically modified foods. All of the corporations that are making billions when they know something is contaminated, dangerous, risky, and the work that they do to keep it quiet. And so if you can at least acknowledge that happens and it's happening in other areas, then you can see how it absolutely is happening with vaccines as well. And passing of the mandatory legislation is just one part of it. It's one part of convincing people this is good for you. And it has this comic, and there's a little comic strip in the book that talks about toxic sludge, why it's good for you.
Yes.
And at the very and it talks about the 3 steps. And the first step is, you have this PR agency that's working for you. The second step is you create all these interviews with people to prove how good it is for you. And by the end of it, you've got people going, I have no idea why we didn't think this was good for us. We were so silly back then, and they're drinking it. And it shows you the process of what really happens. This idea of mandatory vaccines has been fought for 100 years, if not longer. About 120 years. people have been saying this is not okay because you're taking away our rights and because people were getting harmed. And so the question of being able to pass that across the board was not even on the table because so many people disagree with it. And what happens? Little by little, they continue to move forward every decade, a little more. And now they are just at that point where they are sealing the deal. I mean, this is like...
Right.
The extent of, we know what's coming next, which is going to be
right.
adult.
And that's why even people who support vaccination, even people who choose to get the entire CDC schedule of vaccinations, I feel like they at least should want them to have the option to make that decision. I feel like once we give the government the authority to mandate one aspect of medicine, then there's so many other areas they can mandate. It's this huge slippery slope. I can see legislators trying to mandate ADD medications for all children in school,
right.
because it'll make schools safer. It'll make all children learn how to be able to behave better in school. They'll learn better. The teacher won't have to spend extra time with Johnny in the corner because he has ADD, and the other kids in the class are missing out on the teacher's time because she's having to spend so much time with Johnny. If we just medicate Johnny, then no one in the class will be harmed, by their lack of time with the teacher.
Forget if Johnny's harmed.
Right. Makes total sense. Yeah, forget that a minority of kids who take an ADD med will die of a heart attack. It's extremely rare complication, but it happens.
It's not just Johnny. We've got a handful of kids now that would need it in that class.
So we're going to make the classroom more effective and safer for all kids by mandating ADD meds. Let's mandate psychiatric medications for those with mental illness to go to school. Let's mandate antibiotics for every infection. There's so many things that the government could decide on their own is a good idea to mandate. Americans today are giving them the first step in that process. We're saying it's okay to mandate, the vaccination. So again, I'm speaking to you, even if you support vaccination, you should not support any sort of mandated medicine, in my opinion.
Well, because we're not just talking about the polio vaccine.
Right.
We're talking about so many doses
HPV,
of so many
hepatitis
vaccines.
B, vaccines that kids don't need.
Yeah, things that if you really took time to look at, you might say, I don't know about that. I mean, people are worried about fatal diseases spreading and taking over the country.
Right, but we're mandating chickenpox vaccine, which is not a fatal disease.
Well, yeah, and if people did enough research on diseases, they would understand that even if these things were not mandated, we still would not have the kind of spread that we had and the number of cases that we had back in the 50s because so many things have changed.
Right, and but that's kind of like one of the huge points of our three reasons why mandatory vaccines should not be mandated is. Not only has there not been any health crisis, not a single vaccine preventable disease is on the rise. Not a single one. Measles is not on the rise. It's always just been a little up and down. Polio is not on the rise. Yet the media is using the fear that there's a polio-like illness out there, that it's completely unrelated to polio, has nothing to do with polio, so the polio vaccine doesn't help, but the media are using it. Whooping cough is not prevented by the vaccine, so that's can't be looked at as a disease on the rise. Mumps is on the rise because the vaccine doesn't work well. I mean, so basically no infectious disease is on the rise. But the media are using fear to scare people that they could come back or they are coming back. Yeah. That they either are coming back or they could come back if too many people stop. And we know that's not true. Like, I think the point you were starting to make was we are such a healthier nation now as far as sanitation, cleanliness, good nutrition, good access to health care. The America today, we're keeping diseases at bay, not in large part because of vaccination, but in large part because as a society, we're just cleaner and healthier. So measles is not going to come back and start killing people left and right. We have ways to keep these at bay while we have a certain percentage of our population unvaccinated, because that's how it's always been. In the 80s, 50 to 60% of people were vaccinated. We didn't have large outbreaks. Same, the 90s and the 2000s, we have not had huge increases of disease, any increase in disease or huge outbreaks with this not quite fully vaccinated population, so we don't need a fully vaccinated population. Sorry.
Let me be devil's advocate here and say most people that are pro-mandate will say, well, of course diseases aren't on the rise because of vaccines. They will say the reason measles is not on the rise and polio is not on the rise and all these things are not on the rise is because we have almost a completely fully vaccinated population. And I know that a lot of people think that. The thing that I think people are forgetting to realize is if the status quo stayed the status quo without having to get further, without having to get more strict, without giving, because, 10 years ago, we didn't know how many cases of measles we had. Nobody talked about it. You know what I'm saying? When you hear this 100, we knew about it, but I'm saying it wasn't on the news.
There was no fear.
But it wasn't like
you're right. You're right. They didn't make it a news story.
Right. You have 100 measles cases, and now everybody's going, "Oh my God, these freaking anti-vaxxers are bringing this back."
Yeah, but that's how. Yeah, we'll have to edit that. But your point being that's how it was 10 years ago, and that's how it was 20 years ago. We had these little measles outbreaks, but no one was talking about it.
What I'm saying is, you just didn't even know. So 100 sounds like a lot now, but what you don't realize is might have been 150 this year and this year and this year and all these other years that you just didn't know the number.
Right.
So you think it's going up, and you think it's going up because of people who are opting out of vaccines. And again, I always have to bring this up, is that the small percentage of people that are opting out, most of those people are partially vaccinated, because even we know to be around 1%, less than 1% are totally unvaccinated. According to the National Institute of Health, the number of completely unvaccinated is much lower than people think. And 1% is just not enough to do anything to herd immunity. It's not enough to shift, some major outbreak and take over the country. And if you can go back into the 80s, like you're saying, 40% of people were unvaccinated for a particular disease. And were people dying on the street? Like, do you remember all your friends dying of this? No, it wasn't happening. So now we're looking at 1% or 2% being unvaccinated. It certainly is not the condition where you need to go further. And they are going even further. I mean, every year it's a new bill that's coming out in some state for some further advancement. They will not stop until they get everybody mandated, probably on the CDC schedule, and also every adult mandated for their employment. Every employment, not just medical establishments. I know.
So you're right. It is coming to adults as well. And then I just want to just for the sake of completeness and making sure that the audience is educated about this. Sorry, I stepped away from the mic for a second there. The vaccines that we know don't prevent the spread of its disease are for sure whooping cough, diphtheria, tetanus, polio vaccine that we use today, and the flu shot. And then there are a couple diseases that don't even spread in schools, hepatitis B, tetanus again. So basically, in California, the law, they mandated 10 diseases be vaccinated against for all school members. 8 out of those 10 diseases either don't circulate in schools or the vaccine doesn't prevent the spread. The only 2 diseases that even circulate in schools still are chickenpox and whooping cough. Those are the only 2. No one's afraid of chickenpox. Yeah. It's a routine childhood illness, and the whooping cough, the vaccine doesn't help. So, but the way they can pass this again is there's the pharma and the media mantra that vaccines are so good, it's okay to mandate them. Who cares if they don't prevent the disease spread, or who cares if that disease is not transmissible in school? We kind of already said this, but
or who cares if some kids are going to get hurt as a result?
Right. And I guess I want to just maybe wrap up. There's this third reason we haven't really talked much about, but how can you ethically mandate something that we know is going to harm certain kids, because not all vaccines are completely safe or effective. You can say vaccines are safe, effective all day long until you're blue in the face, but you can't say that they're safe for everybody, and you also can't say that the complete schedule of vaccinations that we have, or even the legally mandated schedule, we can't say that's safe because we haven't researched it. We have not proven the actual schedule is safe, and for me, that's very ethically problematic. So I don't know. There's so much. I don't know. There's so much we could talk about here, but I think that basically our passion is. We're here just to educate people. But again, I would like to see Americans come together on this, both Democrats and Republicans, both conservative people that maybe are more in favor of, of individual rights over government powers, but maybe even, people who are political liberal, in their politics. Again, I mean, I feel like the number of constituents in our country that I think support any medical mandates is probably very tiny. But again, it's the well-funded lobbyists and corporations that, regardless of what the general public feels, they're going to fund these programs and these bills and get them pushed through. And so, again, I think it's time we hopefully stand up. And we're watching Connecticut and Maine and New York. Hopefully things can go the right way in those states. We know that these mandatory laws have failed to pass in other states recently, but they'll keep trying. They'll keep trying every year, and hopefully we can take California back eventually. On the other hand, I have this sinking feeling, Melissa, that I'd love to be optimistic about this and say, hey, don't worry, everybody, everything's going to be okay. But I have the sinking feeling that the general public is going to sit back on the idea that vaccines are just so good that we just might let these legislators mandate these things for our children, because it's okay to mandate things for children, apparently. And then they'll start mandating it for adults. Adults might rise up and start fighting against it, but I don't know if they're going to win. I don't know where we're going to be in 5 to 10 years. It's kind of hard to predict.
Yeah.
But so I'm so sad now. So I hate to end on a sad note, but there it is. Do you have anything encouraging you can maybe cheer me up with?
No.
Sorry.
Not even into the mic. No, I can't.
Yeah.
Nothing encouraging really until more people learn about what's going on. And again, supporting mandatory vaccines to where you take away any person's right to opt out would only be excusable if no one's getting harmed and if it was completely effective. And because we know those two
necessary.
Things, and because we know those two things are not happening, it does seem criminal that this is going on and that people are just okay with it. They assume, though, in people's defense, they assume these vaccines will stop all of this, and that's why it's okay.
Right.
But they don't know this other side, the other side that these vaccines are not going to stop the spread of diseases in schools or anywhere else, because diseases are cyclical. They come and go. Some years are more than others. International travel affects whether or not it comes here.
Yeah.
It is not the result of the 1% to 2% that are opting out.
Yeah. And in fairness, I feel like in a few cases, vaccines do help prevent the spread. In some cases, when people do get a measles vaccine, it works in about maybe 95% of kids. It does help prevent the spread, but then there's going to be 5% who are fully vaccinated. It did not help prevent the spread.
And you're just talking about children, but then you have all the ones that
you have all the unvaccinated adults. You have all the unvaccinated teacher, you have all the adults and the teachers and the school administrators, even the school workers, and the parents coming to school. They're all effectively unvaccinated for measles.
But they feel very confident that they are totally covered because they got their vaccine when they were a child.
Yeah, even though it's worn off by now. So there's so many unvaccinated people walking around school. So even if you have a vaccine like measles, where it will help prevent the spread in some cases, there's so many unvaccinated people in the area whose vaccines have worn off. And in the current status quo, we don't have any increases. There's no health risk. So,
and it's an extremely contagious disease. So if with these rates of unvaccinated adults, it should be spreading everywhere.
You're right,
if it
and it's not. Measles is not spreading. It is not spreading. I can't say that enough. And
it's not increasing.
Right,
Everybody
it's not
keeps
increasing.
It's not increasing. If you look at data over the last 20, 30 years, you will see this is absolutely consistent and oftentimes lower than other years that we've had where there was not a big crisis.
And it's never been fully eliminated. And anyway, so we've been at this for about an hour, so maybe we'll wrap it up. And do we have a happier topic to talk about next?
Oh, a happier topic? Not really.
Well,
actually, we'll go into measles. We'll go into measles next.
Okay, Actually, you're right. Yeah, we're going to do a complete thing just on measles, the disease and the vaccine. So you can kind of, add that to this episode, and you'll be fully educated about measles and what to do about it. So, well, this has been the vaccine conversation. What I wanted to say before we wrap up is people are kind of, wondering, well, what can I do? Number one, you can help, organizations educate others, and you can talk to your legislators about these issues. But I mean, organizations like Bobby Kennedy's organization, Children's Health Defense, our organization, there's a number of nonprofit organizations that are fighting these issues and helping to educate.
NVIC.
Right. Yeah. National Vaccine Information Center. I mean, they're the oldest group, and maybe even the largest group out there.
Very comprehensive with all their state data with new bills that come out.
Yes.
It's a great resource for this.
Support these organizations. Support them. Show your support, and they can help educate legislators. We don't necessarily. We don't fight specific laws, per se, but we do fight against the general idea of mandatory vaccination. And so,
I think
that's one thing the audience can do.
One of the most powerful things I think you could do is once you're armed with this information, and the next time you're at a dinner party, the next time you're chatting up a mom at school and she says, well, I'm so glad they're passing this law because it's going to stop measles from spreading. And or pertussis, or I'm so scared of whooping cough. Thank God they have, vaccine mandates and eliminated those personal belief exemptions. If now that you're armed with knowledge, that's the time that you want to say, well, actually, if you knew the information on pertussis, you'd find out that there are a lot of asymptomatic carriers. Do you know that people getting vaccinated does not keep them from spreading it? So even in fully vaccinated communities, this is still spreading. Yeah,
90% of kids who caught whooping cough in our California outbreak were vaccinated.
And 90%. I think that's important because that, to me, one person starts to add up. And that is the most powerful thing you could do is correct somebody's misinformation.
Right.
Because the reason they feel it's okay to push these mandates is because they think it will stop disease.
Right.
When we realize it's not going to stop the disease, then it's not okay to take away somebody's rights.
Yes, and we actually have an article on our immunityeducationgroup.org website specifically geared towards this. It's one of our one-pagers called Mandatory Vaccination Won't Significantly Reduce Illnesses in Schools. Should take out that word significantly because it won't reduce illnesses in schools. And so, if you kind of want some easy access to some of these data.
Don't we have another one, Why Mandatory Vax Laws Won't Work, titled that? Or is this this one?
Yeah,
okay.
That's this one, yeah.
But Immunity Education Group.
Yeah, you can read that. You can arm yourself with that. You can point people to even just to that article, and they might be interested to get educated about it.
Because it's not like you need to force your opinion on somebody. It's important to correct misinformation. And a lot of times you'll see these terrible videos that go viral about, what anti-vaxxers say, and let's clear this up. But what they're saying is incorrect. Like, a lot of the information that you see is the wrong information. And so if you actually have the information, the facts, the data, it's your responsibility as a citizen to let somebody else know in a kind way, actually that's not true, or what you were told is not really 100% of the truth.
Exactly, and don't stay silent.
Yeah, and don't stay silent.
So many people are so afraid to speak up about vaccines. You, as an individual, can think of creative ways to open the conversation without creating hostility and without people, kicking you out of their house. Just, be friendly about it. Be positive. You don't start saying, all vaccines are evil and terrible. Just start opening, did you know this one aspect?
And I'd be happy, if you want more information, I'd be happy to email you.
So I'm excited. I'm excited.
See, I cheer you up.
I know you did. Thank you, Melissa. Because there is something people can do.
This is the only thing people can do.
Right.
Honestly, I really believe that. The only thing you can do is help educate people, but not in the way that you're trying to convince them of your belief system. Help to break these patterns of misinformation that we are always seeing through the PR industry that we know pushes the message on the media and the things that we're told subconsciously. In this book, it says this PR executive is like a president, said, good PR doesn't look like PR, it looks like news.
Okay.
And it's so true. They essentially want the message to come across as if it's news, as if it's science. Okay. And really, it is the message of whoever is paying their check to make sure the narrative comes out to what it is. So I don't blame the people that believe all these things. They've heard them enough times that they believe it to be truth. But what we have to do is understand what the real truth is, and it's our obligation as citizens to tell another person, hey, by the way, this is actually the truth, and here's my information on that, and I'd be happy to chat with you or pass it along to you, because I would agree with some of these laws if it did what it said it did, but it doesn't.
Yes.
And that's the bottom line.
Okay, well, thanks for hanging in there with us for more than an hour, and
We keep trying going for the short episodes. It just doesn't happen. Next one's gonna be short.
Yes.
These
Okay.
ones
All right.
short.
Well, we've already said most of what we want to say. Well, let's stop talking. Wrap
Stop.
up this
Okay.
episode. Okay.
No, you stop
Bye,
talking
everyone.
first.
No.
Quick.
Okay, guys. See you on the next episode. Bye.
I didn't even want to say bye because I would be continuing to talk.
We're gonna be the peace we wanna see in the world. Yeah, be the peace we wanna see in the world. Yeah, be the love we wanna see in the world. Be the joy we wanna see in the world. Be the change we wanna see in the world.
The information in this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as medical advice. Always consult your healthcare professional for information on vaccines and infectious diseases.